Tonight, we examine a case that once commanded national attention and then became part of British legal history. A single investigation, a single verdict, and a legacy that has endured for more than a century. The case of Marion Gilchrist begins in Glasgow, Scotland, in December of 1908. Glasgow at that time was among the largest and most prosperous cities in the United Kingdom, a centre of shipbuilding, engineering, and international trade that had earned itself the description of the second city of the empire. The city's population had grown rapidly through the 19th century, drawing labour from the Highlands, from Ireland, and from across Europe, and by the first decade of the 20th century, it counted well over 750,000 residents within its municipal boundaries. Glasgow's wealth was built on the Clyde, on the yards that produced ships for navies and merchant fleets around the world, and on the engineering and manufacturing trades that supplied them. That wealth was distributed unevenly across the city. The East End and much of the city centre held some of the most crowded housing in Europe. Tenement blocks let out room by room to labouring families, while the West End, further from the river and the factories, had developed as a district of substantial sandstone terraces and crescents built for the professional and mercantile classes. Queen's Terrace on West Princes Street stood within this West End district, a short distance from the university and from Kelvin Grove Park. The terrace was composed of the solid, dressed stone tenement flats, characteristic of Glasgow's more prosperous quarters, built to a scale and finish intended for households of some means. Flats of this kind were typically arranged over several floors, each let as a self-contained residence, with the more substantial examples occupying an entire story and commanding rents well beyond the reach of the city's labouring population. Residents of this class of building included merchants, professional men, and women of independent means living on inherited or invested wealth. The streets were lit by gas, swept and maintained to a standard consistent with the district's status, and policed by a Glasgow constabulary that by 1908 numbered among the more organised municipal forces in Britain. December brought early darkness to the city, with daylight fading by mid-afternoon and the gas lamps lit along the terraces by early evening, so that much of the ordinary business of a winter evening, visiting, errands, deliveries, was conducted after dark. It was into this setting, within a first-floor flat at number 15 Queen's Terrace, that Marion Gilchrist had established her household. She was a woman in her 80s, unmarried, and possessed of considerable personal wealth, much of which she held not in a bank, but in jewellery kept within the flat itself. The precise circumstances of her birth are not established with certainty in the surviving record, and her exact age at the time of her death has been given variously as 82 and 83, a discrepancy the available sources do not resolve. What the record does establish is that she came from a well-to-do Glasgow family, that she never married, and that she had no children. By the final years of her life, she was a woman of independent means, living alone but for the assistance of a servant, in a flat that reflected both her wealth and her considerable caution about protecting it. Gilchrist's household was run on lines that her relatives, neighbours, and the servants who worked for her would later describe, in various settings, as unusually careful. She kept the outer door of her flat secured with a chain, in addition to its ordinary lock, and she was reported to have been reluctant to admit anyone she did not recognise or who could not account satisfactorily for their presence at her door. Her jewellery, rather than being kept in a single strong box or bank deposit, was distributed across several hiding places within the flat, a practice that was known to at least some members of her circle and that would later assume considerable significance in the investigation of her death. She maintained a small domestic staff, and at the time of her death, her household consisted of herself and a young servant who lived in the flat with her. She had a married niece living elsewhere in Glasgow and other family connections in the city, though the surviving record does not establish the full extent of her family circle or provide the names of her parents. The record available for this account does not establish the specific date of Marion Gilchrist's birth, nor the names or occupations of her parents, beyond a general description of the family as one of some standing in Glasgow. What can be stated is that by December of 1908, she had lived for many decades as an unmarried woman of means, that she had built a substantial personal fortune reflected chiefly in jewellery rather than in property or securities, and that she had arranged her domestic life around the protection of that wealth. She was, by every account that survives, a private woman, wary of strangers and accustomed to a settled and guarded routine within her West End flat. If you value cases told this way, drawn from records rather than speculation, subscribe to the channel. And if you would like to read more of these stories, The Forgotten Women of Victorian Britain is linked in the top line of the description. Now, back to the record. The evening of the 21st of December 1908 began for Marion Gilchrist as countless evenings before it had begun. She employed a young servant, Helen Lambie, sometimes recorded in the surviving documents as Nellie Lambie, who lived in the flat and attended to the ordinary business of the household. It had long been the practice of the household that Lambie would, in the early evening, step out briefly on some short errand, generally to purchase a newspaper, leaving her employer alone in the flat for a matter of minutes. This was not an unusual occurrence, and nothing in the surviving record suggests that either woman regarded it as carrying any particular risk. The flat's outer door remained secured in Lambie's absence, consistent with the household's habitual caution, and Gilchrist was left to her own devices for what was expected to be a short interval. At approximately 7 o'clock that evening, Lambie left the flat on this customary errand. In the flat immediately below, a resident named Arthur Adams was at home that evening in the company of his sisters. Nothing in the surviving record indicates any dispute, threat, or unusual disturbance involving Marion Gilchrist in the days or hours preceding this errand. There had been no reported break-in attempts at the flat, no known confrontation with a stranger or acquaintance, and no altered pattern in her household's routine. The evening had begun, in other words, in the ordinary manner of countless evenings in that flat, with Gilchrist alone for a brief period while her servant attended to a small domestic task, and with a downstairs neighbour occupied in his own home a single floor below. It was during this short interval, with Lambie absent from the flat and Adams at home below, that Arthur Adams became aware of a disturbance from the flat above him. He described hearing what he took to be a heavy fall, followed by further sounds of disturbance from the flat that he knew to be occupied that evening only by Marion Gilchrist. Concerned by the noise, Adams went up to the door of the flat and rang the bell, seeking to establish whether anything was amiss. He received no answer. After a period, and following what he described as a second and more violent disturbance from within, he returned to the landing outside the flat a second time. It was at this point, as he stood outside the door, that Helen Lambie returned from her errand. The circumstances of Marion Gilchrist's household in the moments immediately preceding her death were, in summary, unremarkable in every particular but one. For a period of some minutes, an elderly woman of considerable wealth, known to guard her privacy and her possessions with some care, was alone within a flat whose door had, in the ordinary course of events, been secured. No forced entry had yet occurred. Nothing in the record suggests she had any warning of what was to follow. When Lambie returned to the door and found Adams waiting on the landing, the two entered the flat together. As they stepped inside, a man emerged from within, walking past them without hurry or apparent alarm, and passed out through the door and down the stair. Neither Adams nor Lambie raised any immediate alarm at the sight of him. Adams later stated that he assumed the man had legitimate business within the flat, perhaps a tradesman or an acquaintance of the household, and Lambie, who had a brief and partial view of him in the poor light of the stairwell, did not at that moment identify him as a stranger to be feared. The man descended the stair and left the building unchallenged, disappearing into the darkened streets of the West End within moments of the two witnesses entering the flat. Adams and Lambie proceeded into the flat's interior moving toward the dining room from which the earlier disturbance had seemed to originate. There they found Marion Gilchrist lying on the floor. She had been beaten about the head, and it was immediately apparent to both of them that she'd suffered severe injury. Lambie, who had lived and worked in the flat for some time, and who knew its rooms and contents well, would later be asked in the course of the investigation to look about the flat and note whether anything appeared to be disturbed or missing. Adams, for his part, went immediately to summon assistance, and within a short time the police and a doctor had been called to the scene. The dining room in which Gilchrist was found showed signs of some disturbance, consistent with a struggle or a search, though the flat as a whole did not present the appearance of having been ransacked in any wholesale fashion. Gilchrist's jewellery, kept as it was in a number of separate hiding places about the flat rather than gathered in a single strongbox, was found to be very largely intact. Of her substantial collection, only a single item could be positively established as missing: a crescent-shaped diamond brooch. The remainder of her jewellery, including pieces of considerable value that had been stored in locations not far from where the missing brooch had been kept, remained where she had placed it. This discrepancy between the scale of her holdings and the narrowness of what had actually been taken would occupy investigators, and later the court, for a long time to come. The outer door of the flat showed no sign of having been forced. There was no broken lock, no damaged frame, no indication that entry had been achieved by any means other than being admitted. This fact, established at the scene on the night of the 21st of December and confirmed in the days that followed, anchored the working theory that would guide the investigation from its earliest hours: that Marion Gilchrist, a woman known for the caution with which she guarded her door, had herself admitted the person who then killed her, whether by recognizing him, by accepting some plausible reason for his presence, or by some other circumstance that the surviving record does not resolve. Precisely how the intruder gained admission, and by what pretext or acquaintance he persuaded a notably wary woman to unfasten a chained and double-locked door, remained then, and remains now, a matter the investigation was never able to establish with certainty. Word of the killing spread through the West End with the particular speed such news commands in a settled residential district, where neighbours knew one another's households and comings and goings were a matter of ordinary notice. Within Queen's Terrace itself, and along the surrounding streets of the district, the killing of an elderly, reclusive woman of known wealth in her own home, in the early evening, by a man who had walked calmly past two witnesses on his way out, was recognised at once as an event of considerable gravity, the kind that would draw the attention of the newspapers and of the wider city beyond the immediate neighbourhood. Police officers arriving at the scene that evening set about the work of securing the flat, examining its rooms, and beginning the process of establishing exactly what had occurred and in what order. The investigation into the death of Marion Gilchrist was formally opened that same night, under the direction of the Glasgow City Police, with the Procurator Fiscal's office overseeing the criminal process in the manner required by Scots law. Officers were dispatched to canvass the neighbouring flats and the surrounding streets, seeking any resident who might have observed a stranger about the terrace in the hour of the killing. Statements were taken from Arthur Adams and from Helen Lambie regarding the man they had seen leaving the flat, though the accounts each of them gave proved on close examination to be limited by the poor light of the stairwell and the brevity of the encounter. Lambie described a man of a certain build and dress, but her description, given first informally and then in more formal statements over the following days, was not consistent in every particular, a fact that would later assume considerable weight. A physician had been summoned to the flat on the night of the killing and had examined Marion Gilchrist where she lay. It was established that she had died as a result of severe head injuries inflicted by repeated blows, and that death had followed rapidly upon the attack. The examining officers noted the position of the body within the dining room and the general disorder of the room itself, consistent with a struggle having taken place, though the flat's other rooms showed comparatively little disturbance. The physician's findings, communicated to the police in the days following the killing, established the cause of death without ambiguity, and this conclusion was not seriously contested at any later stage of the proceedings. Investigators turned their attention next to the flat's contents, working through Gilchrist's jewellery with the assistance of Helen Lambie, who as the household servant had some knowledge of what the flat ordinarily contained. This process confirmed what had been suspected from the first hours of the inquiry, that only the single crescent brooch could be identified with confidence as missing, while jewellery of considerably greater value, stored in places not far removed from where the brooch had been kept, remained untouched. This detail was recorded carefully by the investigating officers, who recognised that it did not sit easily with the theory of an ordinary opportunist thief, a person who might have been expected either to take a great deal more, given the time available to him, or to have been disturbed before taking anything at all. That the intruder had taken one item only, and a comparatively modest one at that, while leaving pieces of far greater worth close at hand, was noted in the police record as a point requiring further explanation, though no explanation was ever established with certainty. Officers extended their inquiries into the wider neighbourhood over the following days, seeking any account of a man seen loitering near Queen's Terrace in the hour before the killing, or leaving the district in the minutes after it. Several residents came forward with impressions of a figure seen on the street that evening, though these accounts, gathered some time after the event and shaped by the inevitable uncertainty of memory under such circumstances, did not converge on a single reliable description. The investigation also turned to the question of who among Gilchrist's acquaintance might have known both the layout of her flat and the fact that she kept jewellery hidden about its rooms, rather than in a bank, a detail not widely known beyond her immediate household and family circle. This line of inquiry did not, on the surviving record, produce a suspect from within that circle, and the investigation's attention turned instead toward the wider population of Glasgow's pawnbrokers and dealers in precious stones, on the reasoning that a stolen brooch would, in time, need to be sold or pledged. It was this line of inquiry, canvassing the pawnbrokers and jewellers of the city for any recent transaction involving a diamond brooch, that within days of the killing produced the name that would dominate the remainder of the case. Inquiries among the trade turned up a report that a man had recently pawned a diamond brooch at a shop in the city, and that this same man had, in the days immediately following the murder, made arrangements to leave Glasgow for the United States. To officers working a case in which a diamond brooch was missing and a killer had walked calmly away from the scene of his crime, the coincidence of timing was immediately suggestive, and the investigation fixed with some speed upon this man as its principal suspect, a gambler and dealer of no fixed reputation, living under more than one name in the city, who was by then already gone from Glasgow and bound by way of Liverpool for New York. That man was known in Glasgow as Oscar Slater, though this was itself one of several names under which he had lived. He had been born Oscar Joseph Lechsteiner in the town of Oppeln in German Prussia, in the province of Upper Silesia, to a Jewish family in approximately the year 1872. In the years before his arrival in Scotland, he had lived under a succession of names, including Oscar Slater and, on at least one occasion, Otto Sandow, moving between London, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and cities in the United States, and supporting himself through a variety of occupations that included dealing in precious stones and the running of small gaming operations. He had no recorded history of violent crime. By the closing months of 1908, he was established in Glasgow, living with a woman described in the record as his mistress, and conducting a modest business as a bookmaker and gambling housekeeper, an occupation regarded by the respectable society of Edwardian Glasgow with considerable suspicion, whatever the truth of his personal conduct. In the weeks before Marion Gilchrist's death, Slater had pawned a diamond brooch of his own at a Glasgow pawnbroker's, a transaction entirely unconnected to the crime that would soon be laid at his door, and one that had taken place some time before the 21st of December. He had also, independently of any of these events, made arrangements some time earlier to leave Glasgow for America, booking passage under the name Otto Sando, a step consistent with a man of his itinerant habits and by no means unusual in the pattern of his life to that point. When police inquiries into the pawned brooch reached his name in the days following the murder, these two entirely separate facts, an unrelated brooch pawned before the crime and a departure for America already arranged before the crime, were drawn together by investigators into an appearance of flight, and Slater's name was fixed upon as that of the wanted man. By the time Glasgow police had settled on Slater as their suspect, he had already sailed and had arrived in New York under the name he had travelled by. The Glasgow authorities set in motion the process of extradition, seeking his return to Scotland to face trial for the murder of Marion Gilchrist. Slater was taken into custody by the American authorities on the strength of the Glasgow request, and extradition proceedings were conducted in New York over a period of some weeks, during which Slater maintained that he had no connection whatsoever to the killing and had left Glasgow for reasons entirely of his own, unrelated to the death of a woman he stated he had never met and never so much as heard of before his arrest. His protests did not prevent the extradition from proceeding, and in the early months of 1909 he was returned to Scotland under police escort to answer the charge. Once Slater had been returned to Glasgow, the process of formal identification began. Helen Lambie, along with other witnesses who had reported seeing a man in the vicinity of Queen's Terrace on the evening of the killing, was asked to view Slater and state whether he was the man observed. In the period before these identification procedures took place, Slater's photograph had already appeared in the Glasgow press in connection with the case, a fact that would later be raised as a serious defect in the reliability of any subsequent identification, since a witness shown a suspect's photograph beforehand cannot be said to identify him independently when later asked to pick him from among others. Notwithstanding this difficulty, sufficient identification evidence was gathered to support proceeding against Slater, and he was committed, under the process appropriate to Scots law, to stand trial before the High Court of Justiciary on the charge of murder. The trial of Oscar Slater opened on the 3rd of May, 1909, at the High Court of Justiciary, sitting in Edinburgh, rather than in Glasgow, where the crime had taken place, in keeping with the practice of the day for cases of this gravity to be heard on circuit before the High Court. The proceedings were presided over by Lord Guthrie, and were expected, given the public interest the case had already attracted through the newspapers, to draw considerable attention both within the courtroom and beyond it. The trial was to last 4 days, a substantial length for a criminal proceeding of the period, reflecting the volume of evidence and witness testimony that both Crown and defence intended to bring before the jury. Under the procedure of Scots law then in force, the jury empanelled to hear the case against Slater numbered 15 persons, a larger body than the 12-member juries familiar under English practice, and one that would in due course return its verdict not by the simple binary of guilty or not guilty alone, but with the additional possibility, distinctive to Scotland, of a verdict of not proven. The Crown's case against Slater was presented by counsel acting for the Lord Advocate's Department and rested upon 3 principal strands of evidence: the identification testimony of witnesses, chiefly Helen Lambie, who stated that the man they had seen leaving Marion Gilchrist's flat resembled the accused; the fact of Slater's departure for America under an assumed name in the days following the killing; and the fact that he had recently pawned a diamond brooch, a fact the Crown invited the jury to associate with the missing brooch from Gilchrist's flat, notwithstanding that the 2 items were demonstrably different and that Slater's transaction had taken place before the murder occurred. The defence, led by counsel briefed on Slater's behalf, mounted a case built upon three principal answers to the Crown's evidence. Witnesses were called to establish that Slater had been elsewhere in Glasgow at the time the killing was said to have occurred, an alibi intended to remove him altogether from the scene of the crime. Evidence was led to show that the brooch pawned by Slater was a piece he had owned and dealt with well before the 21st of December, entirely unconnected to the item missing from Gilchrist's collection. And considerable effort was directed at undermining the reliability of the identification evidence itself, drawing out in cross-examination the circumstance that witnesses had seen Slater's photograph in the press before ever being asked to identify him in person, a sequence the defence argued had irreparably compromised the value of their testimony. Over the course of the 4 days, the court heard at length from Helen Lambie, from Arthur Adams, from the police officers who had conducted the investigation, and from witnesses called on Slater's behalf to speak to his movements on the evening in question. The defence's alibi evidence placed Slater, according to those who testified for him, at a location in Glasgow other than Queen's Terrace during the period in which the killing was said to have taken place, though the jury was left to weigh this testimony against the Crown's identification evidence and against the general suspicion that attached to Slater's character and manner of living, a suspicion the Crown's presentation did not neglect to invoke. Considerable attention was given during the trial to Slater's background and reputation, to his occupation as a gambling house keeper, to his history of travel under different names, and to the general disrepute in which a man of his profession was held by the respectable society from which the jury itself was drawn. It was in his charge to the jury, delivered at the close of the evidence, that Lord Guthrie's summing up would in later years come to be regarded as one of the most consequential features of the trial. His address to the jury dwelt at some length upon Slater's character, his occupation, and the manner of his life, in terms that legal commentators would subsequently judge to have weighted the jury's deliberations against the accused on grounds having little direct bearing on the specific evidence connecting him to the killing of Marion Gilchrist. The jury retired to consider its verdict following this charge, weighing identification testimony that even at the time was recognised as imperfect, an alibi that conflicted with the Crown's account of Slater's whereabouts, and a portrait of the accused's character that had been given considerable prominence in the judge's own address. The jury returned its verdict by a majority of 9-6, finding Oscar Slater guilty of the murder of Marion Gilchrist. Among the 6 who did not join the majority, the surviving record indicates a division between those favouring outright acquittal and those favouring the distinctly Scottish verdict of not proven, a verdict that leaves an accused formally unconvicted while stopping short of a declaration of innocence. The narrow and divided character of the jury's decision was noted at the time as a mark of how finely balanced the evidence against Slater had in fact been, notwithstanding the confidence with which the Crown had presented its case, and the weight Lord Guthrie's charge had lent to questions of character over questions of proof. Lord Guthrie proceeded to sentence upon the jury's verdict, and the sentence of the court was death, in accordance with the law then governing conviction for murder. A date in late May of 1909 was fixed for the execution to be carried out. The verdict and sentence, once reported in the press, produced an immediate and widespread public reaction, extending well beyond Glasgow and Edinburgh, with newspaper commentary raising doubts about the safety of a conviction resting so heavily on contested identification testimony and on a judicial summing up that had dwelt at length upon the accused's character and occupation rather than upon the specific facts connecting him to the killing. Disquiet about the verdict was not confined to sympathetic commentary in the press. Petitions began to circulate within days of the sentence being passed, drawing together signatories who questioned whether the evidence heard at Edinburgh had in fact established Slater's guilt beyond reasonable doubt, and pressing the authorities to reconsider the sentence before it could be carried into effect, These petitions were addressed to the Secretary for Scotland, the office then responsible for matters of this kind within the Scottish administration, and they were pressed with sufficient urgency and sufficient weight of public concern that the case was reconsidered in the days immediately preceding the date fixed for execution. A reprieve was granted only shortly before the sentence was to be carried out, commuting the sentence of death to one of penal servitude for life. No execution took place. Slater, having stood within days of the gallows, was instead removed from the condemned cell and prepared for transfer to the prison in which he would serve the sentence, now substituted for the one the court had originally pronounced. That prison was Peterhead, on Scotland's rugged northeastern coast, the principal establishment in the country for those sentenced to penal servitude, a regime of enforced hard labour, distinct from and harsher than ordinary imprisonment. Peterhead's convicts were set to work chiefly in the granite quarries that supplied stone for harbour works along that stretch of coast, labour conducted in the open, in a climate marked by driving wind and rain for much of the year, under a discipline considerably more severe than that of an ordinary local prison. It was to this regime that Oscar Slater was committed in the summer of 1909 to serve a sentence of unspecified duration under the law's designation of penal servitude for life, with no date of release fixed and no certainty as to whether one would ever come. The years that followed Slater's committal to Peterhead were marked, outside the prison walls, by a campaign for his release that would grow steadily in the 2 decades to come, drawing supporters who were persuaded that the verdict returned at Edinburgh in May of 1909 had been unsafe. Chief among these was the author Arthur Conan Doyle, already established as the creator of Sherlock Holmes, who examined the trial record and concluded that the case against Slater rested on evidence too weak and too compromised to sustain a capital conviction. Conan Doyle set out his conclusions in published pamphlets, and in 1912, in a book titled The Case of Oscar Slater, in which he laid out at length the deficiencies he had identified in the identification evidence, in the treatment of the pawned brooch, and in the judge's charge to the jury. His intervention lent the case a public prominence it might not otherwise have retained so many years after the trial itself, and it marked the beginning of a campaign that would continue, through further setbacks and further delays, for the better part of 2 decades. Conan Doyle's published case for Slater's innocence was joined, some years into the campaign, by evidence of a more troubling kind, arising from within the Glasgow police force itself. A detective named John Thompson Trench, who had taken part in aspects of the original investigation, came forward with the claim that evidence favourable to Slater, evidence that had not been placed before the jury at Edinburgh, had existed at the time of the trial and had not been disclosed to the defence. Trench's willingness to raise these concerns through official channels resulted in disciplinary action against him within the force, a consequence that did nothing to diminish the significance of what he had alleged, and that in time added further weight to the growing conviction among those following the case that the original trial had proceeded on an incomplete and one-sided presentation of the available evidence. The Trench affair, as it came to be known, became a further pillar of the case for reconsidering Slater's conviction, standing alongside Conan Doyle's published critique as evidence that the flaws in the case against Slater were not simply matters of hindsight or sympathy, but had been apparent, at least to some within the investigation, from a much earlier point. Slater's own petitions and the continuing public pressure generated by Conan Doyle's advocacy and by the revelations associated with Trench did not, for many years, produce any mechanism by which his conviction could be formally reviewed. Scotland, unlike England, possessed, at the time of Slater's trial, no established court of criminal appeal, a gap in the machinery of Scots criminal justice that meant a conviction of the kind returned against Slater, however contested it became in the years that followed, had no straightforward avenue for reversal short of executive intervention. It was only with the creation of the Court of Criminal Appeal for Scotland, established by statute in 1926 that a proper legal mechanism came into being through which a case such as Slater's could be formally reheard, and the disquiet generated by his case over the preceding 17 years was itself counted among the pressures that had contributed to the creation of that new court. Slater was released from Peterhead on licence in November of 1927 after very nearly 19 years of penal servitude, though his release at that point did not yet amount to a clearing of his name. His conviction remained on the record, and it was only through a formal appeal brought before the newly constituted Court of Criminal Appeal that the verdict of May 1909 was finally examined by a court empowered to overturn it. That appeal was heard in July of 1928, and the court quashed the conviction, finding the case against Slater not to have been established to the standard required, and in doing so cleared him, nearly 2 decades after his trial, of the murder for which he had been sentenced to death, and had then served close to 19 years of hard labour. Compensation was awarded to Slater following the quashing of his conviction in the sum of £6,000, a sum that fell considerably short of what he and his supporters had sought, and that did not extend to cover the legal costs he had incurred in pursuing his exoneration. The disparity between what had been claimed and what was ultimately paid gave rise to a bitter and public dispute between Slater and Arthur Conan Doyle, whose support had been instrumental in securing the appeal, but who felt that Slater had not adequately acknowledged or compensated him for the years of effort and expense the campaign had cost him. The two men, once allies in the pursuit of a wrongful conviction's reversal, parted afterward on distinctly unfriendly terms, a coda to the case that the record preserves alongside its more celebrated aspects. In the years following his exoneration, Oscar Slater settled in the town of Ayr on Scotland's western coast, living thereafter under his own name and away from the public attention that had followed his case for 2 decades. He is recorded as having married in these later years, though the surviving sources do not establish with confidence the details of that marriage, and he lived out the remainder of his life in comparative obscurity, a private citizen once more after so long a period as a subject of national controversy. He died in 1948. The record available for this account does not establish the circumstances of his death or the location of his burial with certainty. The identity of the person who killed Marion Gilchrist on the evening of the 21st of December, 1908, was never established. No individual other than Oscar Slater was ever charged with her murder, and Slater's own conviction was in time formally overturned. The investigation that followed her death, thorough as it was in certain respects, did not in the end identify with any certainty who had entered her flat that evening, taken a single brooch from among a substantial collection of jewellery, and left her dying on the floor of her dining room, while 2 witnesses stood outside her door. Various theories were advanced in the years that followed the case, some touching upon figures connected to Gilchrist's own family circle, but none was ever substantiated to the standard required to bring a charge, and the surviving record does not permit any of them to be stated as established fact. The case of Marion Gilchrist and the conviction of Oscar Slater has retained a place in British cultural memory that extends well beyond the circumstances of the crime itself, owing in considerable part to its association with Arthur Conan Doyle. Conan Doyle's published pamphlets and his book of 1912 brought the case before a reading public already familiar with his creation of the detective Sherlock Holmes, and the spectacle of the author applying methods of reasoned inquiry to a real miscarriage of justice lent the case an enduring interest that outlasted the original controversy of the trial itself. In the decades since Slater's exoneration, the case has been examined in a number of books devoted to the history of Scottish criminal justice, several of which have given particular attention to the conduct of Detective Trench and the question of what evidence was withheld from the defence at the original trial. It is remembered today chiefly as a case in which a respected author's advocacy contributed materially to the eventual correction of a wrongful conviction, and as a case whose unresolved central question, the identity of the person who actually killed Marion Gilchrist, has never ceased to attract attention from those who study it. Archival material relating to the case has been preserved by institutions including the Glasgow Police Museum and the National Records of Scotland, holdings that have allowed later researchers to examine the original investigation and trial in some detail, and that have supported the continuing interest the case commands among students of Scottish legal history. The trial itself was published in full as part of the notable British Trials series, a compilation that preserved the courtroom testimony, the exchanges between counsel and Lord Guthrie's charge to the jury in a form that has allowed later generations of readers and legal historians to examine the proceedings directly rather than at second hand. And it is this published record, together with the newspaper coverage of the period, that has chiefly sustained the case's continued study. The case is remembered nationally as among the most significant miscarriages of justice in the history of Scottish law, cited repeatedly in discussions of the dangers inherent in identification evidence gathered under conditions that compromise a witness's independence, as occurred when Slater's photograph appeared in the press before any formal identification procedure took place. It is remembered also for its place in the history of Scotland's criminal appeal system, since the absence of any court empowered to review Slater's conviction meant that his case, for the better part of 2 decades, could be pursued only through public petition and executive appeal rather than through the ordinary machinery of law, a gap that the case itself is credited with helping to close through the establishment of the Court of Criminal Appeal in 1926. The social conditions of Edwardian Glasgow bore directly upon both the original investigation and the trial that followed it. Glasgow, in 1908, was a city acutely conscious of class distinction, in which a woman of Marion Gilchrist's standing, living alone but for a servant in a West End flat, represented a household whose vulnerability to crime was recognised even as her wealth and privacy were respected by those around her. Oscar Slater, by contrast, represented a different and less favoured category within the same society. A man of foreign birth, of Jewish descent, living an itinerant life under more than one name, and supporting himself through occupations, gambling, and the keeping of a gaming house that stood well outside the bounds of respectable Edwardian employment. Sentiment against Jewish and other immigrant populations was a live current in British public life in this period, reinforced in the years immediately preceding Slater's trial by legislative debate surrounding the Aliens Act of 1905, which had placed new restrictions upon immigration into Britain and had brought questions of foreign origin and assimilation into prominent public discussion. Slater's background, his manner of living, and the suspicion these attracted independent of any specific evidence connecting him to the killing of Marion Gilchrist, are recorded as having featured prominently in the case built against him and in Lord Guthrie's own charge to the jury, a circumstance that later generations of legal historians have identified as a documented contributing factor in the miscarriage of justice his conviction represented. The trial at Edinburgh in May of 1909 drew crowds to the High Court building throughout its 4 days, a level of public interest reflecting the case's prominence in the newspapers of both Glasgow and Edinburgh in the months since the killing. Reporters from across Scotland and from London papers attended the proceedings, filing daily accounts of the testimony and of Lord Guthrie's conduct of the trial, accounts that were read closely by a public already primed by weeks of coverage of the murder itself and of Slater's extradition from New York. The press coverage of the period recorded queues forming outside the courtroom each morning, and the public gallery filled to capacity for the duration of the proceedings, a level of attention that placed considerable pressure upon the court to be seen to conduct the trial with due process, even as later scrutiny would find that process wanting in several respects. Newspaper commentary following the verdict was not uniform in its support of the outcome. Some papers accepted the jury's finding without evident reservation, reporting the conviction as the resolution of a case that had gripped the city for months. Others, in the days immediately following the verdict, began to publish letters and editorial commentary questioning whether the evidence presented had been sufficient to sustain so grave a conviction, particularly given the narrowness of the jury's majority and the reliance the Crown's case had placed upon identification testimony that even contemporary observers recognised as imperfect. This divided reception in the press in the days after the trial provided much of the initial momentum behind the petitions that would, within a matter of weeks, secure Slater's reprieve from the gallows. The case file generated by the investigation, the trial, and the long campaign that followed grew over the 2 decades between Marion Gilchrist's death and Slater's eventual exoneration into a substantial body of documentation, encompassing police statements, trial transcripts, correspondence relating to the petitions of 1909, Conan Doyle's published pamphlets, the record of Trench's disciplinary proceedings, and the papers generated by the eventual appeal of 1928. It is this accumulated record, preserved across the holdings of the National Records of Scotland and supplemented by the published trial transcript in the notable British Trials series, that has allowed the case to be examined in the detail it has received in the century since, detail extending down to the specific wording of Lord Guthrie's charge to the jury and the precise sequence of the identification procedures that were later judged so unreliable. Within Peterhead itself, the regime under which Slater served his sentence followed the established pattern for convicts sentenced to penal servitude, rising before dawn for a working day spent chiefly in the granite quarries that had supplied the prison with its principal labour for decades before his arrival, breaking and hauling stone in conditions that offered little shelter from the wind and rain characteristic of that stretch of coastline through much of the year. Convicts under this regime were housed and disciplined according to a strict daily schedule, with privileges tied to conduct, and with little prospect, absent some external intervention, of release before the full term implied by a life sentence had been served. It was against this daily reality, sustained for close to 19 years, that the efforts of Conan Doyle and later the revelations associated with Trench were directed, and it was from this daily reality that Slater was at last removed in November of 1927, when his licence of release was granted following the renewed pressure that had built around his case in its final years. The appeal heard before the Court of Criminal Appeal for Scotland in July of 1928 was in itself a proceeding of considerable moment, being among the earliest cases of significance to come before a court that had existed for barely 2 years. The bench that heard Slater's appeal examined the original trial record in detail, including the identification evidence given by Helen Lambie and the other witnesses, the treatment at trial of the pawned brooch, and the content of Lord Guthrie's charge to the jury 19 years earlier. Counsel appearing on Slater's behalf argued that the identification evidence had been fatally compromised by the circulation of his photograph in the press before any formal identification took place, that the brooch evidence had never properly connected him to the crime, and that the trial judge's emphasis upon his character and manner of living had improperly influenced the jury's deliberations on a question that ought to have turned upon evidence alone. The appeal court's judgment, delivered after consideration of these arguments, found that the case against Slater had not been established to the standard the law required, and the conviction of May 1909 was accordingly quashed. The court's reasoning gave particular weight to the deficiencies in the identification process and to the manner in which the original trial had proceeded, findings that amounted, in substance, to an acknowledgement that the verdict returned at Edinburgh 19 years before had rested on evidence too weak to sustain it. The judgment did not identify any alternative suspect, nor did it purport to resolve the question of who had in fact killed Marion Gilchrist. Its effect was confined to the correctness of Slater's own conviction, which it set aside entirely, restoring him in the eyes of the law to the status of an innocent man. The sum of £6,000 subsequently awarded to Slater was determined through a process separate from the appeal judgment itself, and fell well short of the compensation he and his supporters had sought for close to 19 years of wrongful imprisonment, and for the legal costs the long campaign for his exoneration had entailed. Conan Doyle, who had spent considerable sums of his own money and a great deal of time over more than 15 years in pursuit of Slater's vindication, felt that Slater's response to the award, and to Conan Doyle's own claims upon a portion of it in recognition of his efforts, fell short of what was owed him, and the dispute between the two men that followed was conducted, in part, through an exchange of increasingly bitter correspondence, a falling out that neither man is recorded as having repaired before Conan Doyle's own death in 1930. In Ayr, where Slater settled after the conclusion of these disputes, he lived out his remaining 2 decades away from the newspapers that had followed his case so closely in earlier years, a private citizen whose name, once inseparable from one of the most discussed criminal trials in Scottish history, receded gradually from public notice even as the case itself continued to be studied and written about by those with an interest in the workings of Scottish criminal justice. The record available for this account does not establish further detail of his life in these final years, beyond his settlement in Ayr and his death in 1948, and no further certainty is available regarding the circumstances of his death or the location of his burial. The investigation into the death of Marion Gilchrist was formally closed following the quashing of Oscar Slater's conviction. The identity of the person who killed her was never established. The case was entered into the historical record. It has remained there. The verdict stood. The case became part of British memory. We turn now to a second record, quieter than the one just closed and separated from it by both years and miles, drawn from a different corner of England entirely. It concerns a woman whose name once filled the newspapers of an entire capital for a season, and then receded into the files of an investigation that was never brought to a satisfactory close. The question it leaves behind is not so different from the one already examined, only the setting has changed, and the century has turned. The case of Emily Elizabeth Dimmock begins in Camden Town, in the northern reaches of London, in the early autumn of 1907. Camden Town, at that date, was a dense and thoroughly working-class district, built up through the middle decades of the 19th century along the lines of the London and North Western Railway and the Regent's Canal, both of which cut through the area and gave it much of its economic character. The streets were lined with terraced houses of grey brick, many subdivided into lodging rooms let to single working men and women, to railway employees and to families of modest means. The population of the district numbered in the tens of thousands, and its proximity to the railway yards at Euston and King's Cross meant that a considerable portion of its residents were employed in some branch of the railway trade, as porters, clerks, drivers, or dining car staff. The district also lay within reach of the more bohemian quarters of central London, including Fitzrovia and the area around Great Portland Street, where a different population of artists, writers, and commercial draftsmen lived and worked. This proximity meant that Camden Town, though itself a solidly working-class district, was not entirely sealed off from the artistic and professional circles of the West End. Men from those circles were known to travel into Camden Town in the evenings, drawn by its public houses and by the presence of women who supplemented modest incomes through casual arrangements with such visitors. This traffic between one London and another forms an important part of the background against which the case must be understood. By 1907, London had long since become the largest city in the world, its population exceeding 6 million persons, and its street lighting, though improved considerably since the middle of the 19th century, remained gas-fired in many of its residential districts. Camden Town streets were narrow, its pavements uneven, and its public houses numerous, serving as informal meeting points for a population that worked long and irregular hours. The railway itself imposed its own rhythm upon the district. Men employed on the lines, particularly those in dining car and catering service, were frequently required to be absent from their homes overnight, sometimes for a night at a time and sometimes for longer, as their duties carried them to Sheffield, to Manchester, or to other termini along the Midland Railway's routes. This pattern of absence, ordinary and unremarkable in itself, forms a necessary part of the circumstances that preceded the case now under examination. It was into this setting that Emily Elizabeth Dimmock had come to live by the year 1907. She was, at the time of her death, 22 years of age. Her exact date of birth is not established with certainty in the surviving record, and the sources consulted do not permit a precise reconstruction of her family background, her parents, or her early years. What is established is that she came from a working-class background typical of the period, and that by her early 20s she was living independently in London, no longer under the direct supervision of any family household. Among her acquaintances she was known by the name Phyllis, a name used informally within her circle rather than any legal or registered alteration of her given name. Dimmock's occupation in the period immediately preceding her death was mixed in character. She was in a settled domestic relationship with a man named Bertram Shaw, a cook employed in the dining car service of the Midland Railway, working the line between London and Sheffield. The couple lived together at 29 St Paul's Road in Camden Town, in an arrangement that outwardly resembled a marriage, though the surviving record does not establish whether the two had in fact undergone a legal marriage ceremony. In the absence of a confirmed marriage record, the relationship is best described, in the terms available to the historical record, as a domestic arrangement between a man and a woman living as husband and wife, a common enough circumstance in working-class London at the time, whether or not it had been formalised before a registrar or in a church. Alongside this domestic arrangement, Dimmock is recorded as having continued to see other men, including on a paid basis, during the periods when Shaw's railway duties took him away from London overnight. This fact was known in general terms among those who moved in her circle, though the surviving record does not establish precisely how much Shaw himself knew of the practice, nor how he might have regarded it had he known its full extent. Historians examining the case have generally treated this arrangement as one of the ordinary, if precarious, means by which some women in her circumstances supplemented an income that domestic service, needlework, or other more conventional occupations might not have supplied in sufficient measure. The record does not permit further elaboration of the point, and none is offered here beyond what the documented facts establish. Emily Dimmock had, by the late summer of 1907, become acquainted with a number of men who moved between the more bohemian quarters of central London and the working-class streets of Camden Town. Among these acquaintances was a man named Robert Wood, a commercial artist and draftsman employed by a firm engaged in the glass trade, who had known Dimmock for some months prior to September of that year, and had corresponded with her on more than one occasion. The nature and extent of their acquaintance and the frequency of their meetings are matters that would later become central to a criminal investigation and to a trial conducted at the Old Bailey. At this stage of the record, before the events of the 11th and 12th of September are set out, it is sufficient to establish that Wood was known to Dimmock, that he had written to her before, and that his name would enter the case not as an accusation proven, but as a suspicion raised, investigated, and ultimately not sustained before a jury. The lodging house at 29 St Paul's Road, where Dimmock and Shaw made their home, was typical of the district. A terraced building let out in rooms to more than one tenant, with shared access to common areas, and a landlady or superior tenant generally aware, in broad terms, of the comings and goings of those under her roof. Such arrangements offered little privacy in the ordinary course of daily life, yet they also permitted, within their limits, a degree of independence for individual lodgers to receive visitors and to conduct their affairs largely unobserved during the hours when other occupants of the house were themselves absent at work. The room occupied by Dimmock and Shaw would become, within a matter of days, the scene examined by the Metropolitan Police in what was to become one of the most closely followed criminal investigations of the year. Before turning to the immediate circumstances of the 11th and 12th of September, it may be noted that the surviving documentation of Emily Dimmock's life prior to that date is limited in scope. No detailed account of her parents, her siblings, or the household in which she was raised has survived among the sources available for this record. What can be stated is confined to her situation in the months before her death, her residence with Bertram Shaw, her occupation, and her circle of acquaintance, and it is upon this foundation, rather than upon speculation, that the remainder of the case must be built. The circumstances leading up to the crime centre upon the ordinary rhythm of Bertram Shaw's employment, and the manner in which it structured the household at St Paul's Road. Shaw's duties on the Midland Railway's dining car service required him to travel to Sheffield and back on a schedule that kept him away from London overnight on a regular basis. This was not an unusual arrangement for a man in his occupation, and it appears to have been an accepted feature of the couple's domestic life throughout the period of their residence together. On the evening of the 11th of September 1907, Shaw departed London on his scheduled overnight duty, leaving Dimmock alone at the lodgings in St Paul's Road. He was not expected to return until the following day, the 12th of September, after the completion of his railway turn. During the hours of Shaw's absence, Dimmock was seen by several acquaintances in the course of the evening, moving between public houses and streets in the vicinity of her lodgings and the West End district frequented by her wider circle. The precise sequence of her movements during these hours and the identity of any person or persons she may have met is not established with certainty in the surviving record. It is known that she returned at some point in the evening or in the early hours of the following morning to her room at St Paul's Road, and that she was not alone when she did so, or was joined there subsequently by a man whose identity was never conclusively established to the satisfaction of a jury. The evidence bearing upon this question, principally a postcard and a partially burned letter recovered from the room, would form the central thread of the police investigation that followed, and is addressed in full at the appropriate stage of this account. What can be stated plainly of the circumstances leading to the crime is this: a woman living apart from her partner during his required absence on railway duty, in a district where such absences were common, and where her own circle of acquaintance extended into the West End, brought the evening of the 11th of September to a close within her own lodgings. Somewhere between that hour and the return of Bertram Shaw the following day, her life came to an end. The manner of that death, the investigation it provoked, and the trial that followed form the substance of the record that follows. Bertram Shaw returned to London on the afternoon of the 12th of September, his overnight turn on the Sheffield line completed, and made his way back to the lodgings at St Paul's Road as he had done at the end of countless previous shifts. He let himself into the building and proceeded toward the room he shared with Dimmock, expecting to find the household in its ordinary order. Instead, he found the room in a state that made clear something had gone badly wrong. Dimmock lay in the bed, and it was apparent to him at once that she was dead. Shaw raised the alarm without delay, and word was carried to the local police station, from which officers were dispatched to the address within a short space of time. The condition in which Dimmock's body was found indicated that she had died some hours before Shaw's arrival, and that death had come from a wound to the throat inflicted while she lay in the bed, apparently asleep or otherwise unresisting at the moment the injury was suffered. The injury itself was severe and rapidly fatal, and no useful purpose is served by any more particular description of its character than that. There was no evidence recovered from the scene to suggest that Dimmock had struggled against her assailant, nor any indication that a violent confrontation had taken place within the room prior to the fatal act. The room showed signs of having been occupied by two persons during the preceding evening, and various small personal items, along with two pieces of written material that would come to occupy a central place in the subsequent investigation, were found among Dimmock's belongings. Word of the discovery spread quickly through Camden Town and into the wider press of London within a matter of hours. A killing of this character, involving a woman living independently and known to have received male visitors in the absence of her partner, was certain to attract close attention from newspapers already accustomed to reporting at length on crimes of violence against women in the metropolis. Comparisons were drawn in the popular press to killings committed in Whitechapel some 2 decades before, though the two sets of crimes bore little relation to one another beyond the general similarity of a woman found dead by a wound to the throat in a London lodging. The Camden Town case was, from its outset, treated by investigating officers as a distinct matter to be examined on its own evidence, and it is on that basis that the record must proceed. Officers of the Metropolitan Police attached to the district were dispatched to St Paul's Road within a short time of Shaw's report, and the investigation was formally opened under the direction of detectives assigned to the case from Scotland Yard. The room in which Dimmock had been found was examined, and officers proceeded to take statements from Shaw, from the landlady of the building, and from such neighbours and fellow lodgers as might have observed comings and goings during the night in question. None of those questioned in the immediate vicinity of the lodging-house reported having seen or heard anything of note during the hours in which the fatal injury was believed to have been inflicted, a circumstance not unusual in a building of shared and subdivided rooms, where the ordinary sounds of the night were not such as to draw particular attention. Detectives turned next to the task of reconstructing Dimmock's movements during the evening of the 11th of September, a task that required them to trace her through the public houses and streets she had been known to frequent, and to identify, so far as was possible, those with whom she'd been seen in company. Acquaintances of Dimmock's were located and questioned in turn, and a general picture began to emerge of a woman who had spent part of the evening in the company of persons known to her before returning at some point to her lodgings. None of the witnesses interviewed in this stage of the inquiry were able to identify with certainty the man who had ultimately accompanied her back to St Paul's Road, and the investigation, for a period of some days, lacked any single strong line of inquiry capable of resolving the question. The two pieces of written material recovered from Dimmock's room, a partly burned letter and a postcard bearing a hand-drawn image of a rising sun, referring to a public house of that name on Tottenham Court Road, were retained by investigating officers as items of potential significance from an early stage of the inquiry. The postcard in particular contained an arrangement to meet on the evening of the 11th of September, and was signed with the name Alice, closing with a phrase that read, in the wording preserved in the record, "Yours to a cinder." Officers recognised that the postcard, if its authorship could be traced, might identify the person with whom Dimmock had arranged to spend the evening in question, but the investigation lacked at this stage any means of connecting the handwriting on the card to a named individual. It was resolved, after a period during which the inquiry had made limited progress by conventional means, that a facsimile of the postcard should be placed before the public in the hope that someone might recognise the hand in which it was written. This method, though not without precedent in criminal investigations of the period, represented a significant step, placing the resolution of a central piece of evidence directly before the readership of the popular press, rather than confining its examination to the police and the courts. The facsimile was published in the News of the World on the 30th of September 1907, accompanied by an appeal for any person recognizing the handwriting to come forward with information. The publication of the postcard facsimile produced the result that investigating officers had hoped for, though it did so through a channel that placed considerable strain upon a young woman who had, until that point, no formal connection to the case. A woman named Ruby Young, who had been on close terms with Robert Wood over a period of time, recognized the handwriting on the published postcard as belonging to him, having received letters from him written in a similar style and hand. Young did not come forward immediately upon making this recognition. She is recorded as having hesitated for a period of days, weighing the consequences of reporting a man she had known well against the seriousness of the matter under investigation, before ultimately deciding to approach the police with what she knew. Once Ruby Young had supplied her information to investigating officers, the direction of the inquiry shifted decisively toward Robert Wood as a person whose movements and acquaintance with Dimmock warranted close examination. Detectives proceeded to question Wood directly regarding his relationship with Dimmock, his whereabouts on the evening of the 11th of September, and the authorship of the postcard recovered from her room. Wood's own account of the evening and the steps he was found to have taken in the days following the murder to secure a version of events that might account for his movements would become matters of central importance both to the ongoing investigation and subsequently to the criminal trial conducted at the Old Bailey. It emerged in the course of the investigation that Wood had approached Ruby Young in the period after the murder and asked her to provide an account, if questioned, that would place him elsewhere during a portion of the evening of the 11th of September, specifically during the earlier hours before the time at which Dimmock was believed to have returned to her lodgings. This request, made of a woman who would herself go on to supply the evidence that led to his arrest, became a matter of considerable interest to detectives, who noted that Wood had sought to account for his movements during the earlier part of the evening, but had not sought to establish any alibi covering the later hours, generally placed between 3 and 6 in the morning, during which the fatal injury was believed to have been inflicted. Investigating officers regarded this asymmetry as worthy of close attention, though its ultimate significance would be argued from opposing directions by prosecution and defence alike once the matter came before a court. Following the completion of this stage of the inquiry, Robert Wood was taken into custody and charged with the murder of Emily Dimmock, and the case was prepared for committal proceedings before a magistrate in the ordinary course of English criminal procedure, ahead of trial at the Old Bailey. The investigation had, by this point, drawn together the postcard evidence, the testimony of Ruby Young, and such circumstantial material as detectives had been able to assemble regarding Wood's acquaintance with Dimmock and his conduct in the days following her death. Though no witness had been found capable of placing him at the scene of the crime itself, and no physical evidence directly tied him to the fatal act beyond the disputed question of the postcard's authorship. A police surgeon was called to examine Dimmock's body, both at the scene in St Paul's Road and subsequently in a more formal post-mortem examination, in order to establish the cause of death and the general circumstances under which the fatal injury had been inflicted. The examination confirmed that death had resulted from a single, deep wound to the throat, delivered with a sharp cutting instrument, and that the injury would have caused death within a short space of time, likely a matter of minutes rather than hours. The surgeon's findings further indicated that the injury had most probably been inflicted while Dimmock was lying down, in a position consistent with sleep, or with a state in which she offered no resistance to her assailant, a conclusion drawn from the position in which her body was discovered and from the absence of any signs of a struggle within the room. No named record of the examining surgeon has survived among the sources consulted for this account, and the record is accordingly confined to the substance of his findings rather than to his identity. The medical evidence established that the instrument used was consistent with a razor or a blade of similar character, though no weapon was recovered during the course of the investigation that could be conclusively tied to any named individual. This absence of a recovered weapon would remain a persistent gap in the case as it proceeded toward trial, one of several respects in which the evidence available to the prosecution rested upon inference and association rather than upon direct physical proof. The surgeon's estimate of the time of death, placed in the early hours of the 12th of September, was consistent with the period during which Dimmock had last been seen in the company of an unidentified man, and the hour at which Bertram Shaw returned to discover her body, and this estimate was accepted without significant challenge at each subsequent stage of the legal proceedings. An inquest was convened before the coroner having jurisdiction over the district in which Dimmock's body had been found, in accordance with the ordinary procedure required under English law for any death occurring in violent or unexplained circumstances. The coroner's inquest heard evidence from Bertram Shaw regarding the discovery of the body, from the examining police surgeon regarding the medical findings, and from officers of the investigating branch regarding the state of the room and the items recovered from it. The specific wording of the coroner's summing up and the precise formal verdict returned by the inquest jury have not survived in the sources consulted for this account sheet, though the proceedings served their essential purpose within the criminal process, establishing that Dimmock had died by violence at the hand of a person or persons unknown, and thereby clearing the way for the police investigation and any subsequent prosecution to proceed under the ordinary criminal law, rather than under any alternative legal process. The inquest, conducted in the weeks following the discovery of the body and before the conclusion of the police investigation that would lead to Wood's arrest, attracted a degree of public and press attention consistent with the wider interest the case had already generated across London. Reporters were present throughout the proceedings, and accounts of the evidence given by Shaw and by the police surgeon were carried in newspapers read across the city, contributing to a climate of public interest that would only intensify once Wood had been charged and committal proceedings had begun before a magistrate. The inquest record, together with the evidence gathered by investigating officers in the weeks that followed, formed the foundation upon which the case was subsequently placed before the Old Bailey. Following his arrest and the completion of committal proceedings, Robert Wood was brought to trial at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court for London, sitting from the 17th to the 19th of December 1907. The trial was conducted before Mr. Justice Grantham, and the courtroom was reported to have been crowded throughout the 3 days of proceedings, reflecting the intense public interest the case had generated over the preceding 3 months. The prosecution was led by Sir Charles Matthews, appearing with Mr. A.H. Bodkin, while the defence was conducted by Edward Marshall Hall, a barrister already regarded as among the foremost advocates practising at the criminal bar in that period. Wood was formally charged with the murder of Emily Dimmock and entered a plea of not guilty at the opening of proceedings. The case for the prosecution rested substantially upon the postcard and the partly burned letter recovered from Dimmock's room, both of which were presented to the jury as being written in Wood's hand, a conclusion supported by the evidence of Ruby Young and by such additional handwriting comparison as had been obtained in the course of the investigation. The prosecution further placed before the jury evidence of Wood's acquaintance with Dimmock over the preceding months, and evidence concerning his conduct in the days following the murder, including his approach to Ruby Young, requesting that she support an account of his movements during a portion of the evening of the 11th of September. Sir Charles Matthews argued that this conduct, taken together with the handwriting evidence, was sufficient to establish Wood's presence at the scene of the crime and his responsibility for Dimmock's death. Edward Marshall Hall, in conducting the defence, addressed the alibi evidence directly, submitting to the jury that a man guilty of the murder would have sought to account for his movements during the hours in which the fatal injury was believed to have been inflicted, generally placed between 3 and 6 in the morning, rather than confining his request to Ruby Young to the earlier part of the evening alone. Marshall Hall argued that this discrepancy told against the prosecution's theory of guilt rather than in support of it, since an innocent man concerned only with avoiding the appearance of impropriety in having known Dimmock might reasonably seek to obscure an earlier, innocent meeting without troubling to account for hours in which he had, in fact, been elsewhere, and had no reason to suppose his presence would ever be called into question. The defence further challenged the strength and completeness of the handwriting evidence, submitting that identification of authorship on the basis of a brief postcard and a partly burned letter fell considerably short of the standard of proof required in a capital case. A significant feature of the proceedings, remarked upon extensively in the press coverage of the trial, was the decision of Robert Wood to give evidence in his own defence, testifying under oath before the court. This step, permitted under the Criminal Evidence Act of 1898, remained at that date a relatively novel feature of English criminal trials, and a defendant's decision to submit himself to examination and cross-examination in a capital case was watched with particular interest by the legal profession and by the public alike. Wood's testimony addressed his acquaintance with Dimmock, the circumstances under which he had written to her, and his own account of his movements on the night in question, and he was subjected to cross-examination by Sir Charles Matthews concerning the details of that account and concerning his approach to Ruby Young in the days following the murder. The trial proceeded over its full 3 days with the examination of witnesses for both prosecution and defence, the presentation of the handwriting evidence in detail, and closing addresses delivered by counsel on each side. Marshall Hall's closing speech to the jury was afterward regarded by observers of the criminal bar as among the more accomplished pieces of advocacy heard at the Old Bailey in that period, addressing at length the weaknesses in the prosecution's case and urging the jury toward the view that suspicion, however strongly felt, could not be permitted to substitute for proof in a matter carrying so grave a consequence. Sir Charles Matthews for the Crown maintained in his own closing address that the combination of the handwriting evidence, the established acquaintance between Wood and Dimmock, and the conduct surrounding the sought alibi was sufficient to sustain a conviction. At the conclusion of the evidence and the closing addresses, Mr. Justice Grantham summed up the case for the jury, directing them upon the law applicable to a charge of murder and upon the standard of proof the prosecution was required to meet. The jury retired to consider its verdict, and upon returning to court, delivered a verdict of not guilty, acquitting Robert Wood of the murder of Emily Dimmock. The announcement of the verdict was met with loud and immediate cheering within the courtroom, a reaction that press accounts attributed to a wave of public sympathy for Wood that had built steadily over the course of the trial, encouraged in no small part by the effectiveness of Marshall Hall's defence and by a broader public unease regarding the sufficiency of the evidence brought against him. Robert Wood was discharged from the dock immediately upon the return of the verdict, and no further criminal proceedings were brought against him or against any other person in connection with Emily Dimmock's death. The acquittal left the case in a position that the ordinary criminal process does not readily accommodate. A killing that had been thoroughly investigated, that had produced a defendant tried before a full jury, and that had nonetheless concluded without any person being held legally responsible. The public reaction in the immediate aftermath of the trial remained broadly sympathetic toward Wood, a sentiment reinforced by extensive newspaper coverage of his composure under cross-examination and of Marshall Hall's closing address, though this sympathy did nothing to resolve the underlying question of who had, in fact, been responsible for the death of the woman at the centre of the case. In the days and weeks following the trial, the popular press continued to devote considerable space to speculation regarding the true circumstances of Dimmock's death, canvassing a range of theories regarding other men who might have visited her lodgings that night, without any of this speculation producing evidence sufficient to reopen the case against a named individual. The Metropolitan Police, for their part, did not identify any further suspect whose connection to the crime could be pursued with the same evidential weight that had been assembled, however insufficient it ultimately proved against Wood. The investigation, in the formal sense, drew to a close with the conclusion of the trial, leaving the file open in the sense that no person had been convicted, while the practical pursuit of further leads appears from the available record to have diminished markedly once the acquittal had been returned. Bertram Shaw, who had discovered the body of the woman with whom he had shared his home, is not recorded in the sources consulted as having played any further public role in the proceedings once his evidence had been given at the inquest and referred to at trial. Ruby Young, whose recognition of the handwriting on the postcard had set in motion the chain of events leading to Wood's arrest, found herself, in the aftermath of the acquittal, in a position that press commentary of the period noted as an uncomfortable one. A woman who had reported a man she had once known closely to the police, only to see him tried, acquitted, and restored to public sympathy, while she remained associated in the public mind with an accusation that a jury had ultimately declined to accept as proven. The sources consulted for this account do not permit further detail regarding the subsequent course of her life. The verdict returned at the Old Bailey in December 1907 has generally been regarded by later students of the case examining the surviving trial record as a conclusion supportable on the evidence actually placed before the jury, given the largely circumstantial character of the case that the prosecution had been able to assemble. The postcard and the burned letter established at most a documented acquaintance between Wood and Dimmock and a disputed identification of handwriting, while no witness had been produced capable of placing Wood at the scene of the crime during the hours in which the fatal injury was inflicted, and no weapon or other physical evidence had been recovered to connect him directly to the act itself. Whatever suspicion attached to Wood in the court of public opinion in the months before his trial, the formal record of English criminal justice records his case as one concluded by acquittal, and no different verdict has ever displaced that outcome. In the months that followed the conclusion of the trial, the painter Walter Sickert, then established as one of the leading figures of the Camden Town group of artists working in and around the district, produced a series of canvases that took as their subject bleak interior scenes of a nude female figure and a clothed male figure occupying a sparsely furnished bedroom, works that came to be known collectively under the title associated with the case itself. Sickert had no connection to the investigation or to any of the individuals examined in the course of it, and the surviving record establishes no basis for treating him as a suspect in Dimmock's death. His paintings drew instead upon the case as a matter of public notoriety, using its outline as a point of departure for a body of work concerned with the bleaker aspects of urban domestic life in the period, rendered in a style that departed sharply from more conventional or idealised treatments of the female form common in earlier British painting. The paintings attracted considerable comment at the time of their exhibition, both for their subject matter and for the deliberately unglamorous manner in which Sickert rendered his interiors, a style that critics of the period associated with a broader effort among artists of his circle to depict ordinary London life without sentiment or embellishment. In later decades, a separate and distinct body of speculative writing emerged, proposing a connection between Sickert and an entirely different series of unsolved killings committed in London some 2 decades before the Dimmock case, a theory that gained a measure of popular attention through several works of speculative non-fiction published toward the close of the 20th century. This later theory concerns a different investigation, conducted under different circumstances and examined by different historians, and no evidence connects it to the death of Emily Dimmock or to the trial of Robert Wood. Sickert's association with the present case begins and ends with his paintings, produced after the fact, and inspired by its outline rather than by any personal involvement in the events themselves. The case has continued to occupy a place in the literature of English criminal history, principally on account of the trial itself, which is preserved in detail within the notable British Trial series, a set of volumes compiling verbatim or near verbatim accounts of significant British criminal proceedings for the benefit of legal scholars, students, and the interested general reader. The volume devoted to the trial of Robert Wood has served as the primary documentary basis for subsequent accounts of the case, preserving the examination and cross-examination of witnesses, the closing addresses of counsel, and the summing up delivered by Mr. Justice Grantham, and it remains the source against which later retellings of the case are generally checked for accuracy. The historical significance of the case rests upon several distinct grounds beyond its association with Sickert's paintings. It stands as one of the earliest instances in which a defendant charged with murder gave evidence under oath in his own defence before an English court, a right established less than a decade earlier under the Criminal Evidence Act of 1898, and one whose exercise in so serious and closely watched a case drew considerable attention from the legal profession at the time. Commentators on criminal procedure in the years that followed frequently cited Wood's testimony and Marshall Hall's management of it as an illustration of how the newly available right might be deployed to advantage by the defence in a capital trial, shaping to some degree the conduct of subsequent cases in which defendants elected to testify. The case is also frequently discussed as an illustration of the hazards attending an investigation conducted partly through the medium of the popular press. The decision to publish a facsimile of the postcard recovered from Dimmock's room, taken in order to solicit information from the public at a stage when conventional police methods had failed to identify its author, succeeded in its immediate purpose, producing the evidence that led to Wood's arrest. It also had the effect of placing the case and the eventual defendant before the reading public in a manner that shaped opinion well in advance of any formal legal proceedings, a circumstance that legal commentators of the period and since have noted as carrying both evident practical benefits to an investigation otherwise at an impasse, and equally evident risks to the fairness of any trial that might follow such a public appeal. The manner in which the contemporary press reported upon Emily Dimmock herself, in the weeks between the discovery of her body and the conclusion of the trial, has likewise attracted the attention of later historians examining the social attitudes of Edwardian London. Newspaper accounts of the period frequently framed her occupation and her manner of living in terms carrying a distinct moral judgment, describing her circumstances with a mixture of prurient interest and censure that historians have since read as characteristic of the period's broader unease regarding women who supported themselves, in whole or in part outside the bounds of conventional domestic service or marriage. This framing coexisted without evident contradiction in the reporting of the time, with the considerable public sympathy later extended to Wood following his acquittal, a juxtaposition that later commentators have identified as revealing of the differing standards by which the press and public of the period judged the victim of the crime, and the man tried, however, inconclusively in connection with it. The district of Camden Town itself retained, for a period of years following the case, an association in the public imagination with the killing, an association reinforced by Sickert's paintings and by the continuing circulation of newspaper retrospectives on notable, unsolved crimes of the Edwardian decade. The lodging house at St. Paul's Road, along with the wider pattern of subdivided working-class housing that had characterised the district at the turn of the century would itself undergo substantial change over the decades that followed, as slum clearance and redevelopment schemes altered large sections of Camden Town's housing stock. Though such changes lie beyond the period addressed by the present record, and are noted here only to establish that the physical setting of the case did not survive unaltered into later times. The proceedings at the Old Bailey in December of 1907 drew crowds that gathered outside the court from the early hours of each of the 3 mornings on which the trial sat, a public presence sufficiently large that additional police constables were posted along the approaches to the building to manage the flow of spectators seeking entry to the public gallery. Newspapers of the period recorded queues forming well before the doors opened, composed of persons drawn by the notoriety the case had already achieved through 3 months of press coverage since the discovery of the body in September. Inside the courtroom itself, the press bench was reported to have been filled to capacity throughout the 3 days of the hearing, with representatives of the London dailies and of provincial papers alike seated to record the proceedings for readers across the country, a level of attention that placed the case among the most closely followed criminal trials conducted in the capital that year. Mr. Justice Grantham, who presided over the trial, had by 1907 sat upon the bench for a number of years and was known among members of the legal profession for a manner of conducting proceedings that some contemporaries regarded as more openly engaged with the substance of a case than was customary among judges of the period, occasionally interjecting during examination in a manner that drew comment in the legal press. His summing up in the Wood trial was reported at length in the newspapers of the following day, setting out for the jury the elements the prosecution was required to establish, and the weight properly to be given to evidence resting upon disputed handwriting identification, rather than upon direct testimony or physical proof tying a defendant to the scene of a crime. The jury impanelled for the trial consisted of 12 men, drawn in the ordinary manner from among those qualified for service under the property and residence requirements, then governing eligibility for jury duty in England. A body of citizens who would have brought to their deliberations no specialised legal training but the ordinary standards of judgment applied by jurors of the period to questions of fact and credibility. Their deliberation, following the conclusion of the judge's summing up, was reported in the press of the following morning to have lasted a comparatively short time before the jury returned to deliver its verdict, a detail that some commentators of the period took as an indication that the panel had found the case for the prosecution wanting in a fairly decisive manner, rather than as one presenting genuine difficulty requiring extended deliberation. The defence conducted by Marshall Hall in the case has since been examined at length by students of advocacy and of the criminal bar, in part because it represented a comparatively early demonstration of a mode of defence he would go on to employ, with variations in a number of other prominent capital trials over the following 2 decades of his career. His method, as illustrated in the Wood case, rested upon a close and sustained argument from the internal logic of the prosecution's own evidence, turning what might otherwise have appeared incriminating, namely Wood's approach to Ruby Young in search of an account of his movements, into a point that told in the defendant's favour once examined for what it did and did not cover. This technique of arguing from the shape and gaps of the prosecution's case rather than from an alternative theory of events was noted by contemporaries as a significant contributor to the acquittal, and Marshall Hall's reputation as one of the leading criminal advocates of his generation was considerably strengthened by the outcome of the trial. The Rising Sun public house on Tottenham Court Road, whose emblem the fateful postcard had depicted, continued for some years afterward to be associated in the public mind with the case, its premises noted in press retrospectives as the point of origin for the piece of evidence that had, in the end, determined the entire course of the investigation. The establishment itself was one among a great many public houses serving the population of central London's more bohemian quarters at the turn of the century, a meeting place used by artists, models, and others moving within the circles Robert Wood himself frequented. And its role in the case illustrates the manner in which the geography of Edwardian London, its public houses, lodging streets, and railway lines bore directly upon the sequence of events that led from an evening's arrangement to a woman's death and, ultimately, to a trial that held the attention of the entire city for the better part of a season. The economic circumstances that shaped the choices available to a woman in Emily Dimmock's position in 1907 were bound up with the limited range of occupations generally open to working-class women in London at that date. Domestic service, employment in the garment trades, and work as a shop assistant or laundress represented the principal avenues of respectable employment, each carrying wages that left little margin above the cost of lodging, food, and clothing in a city where rents in districts such as Camden Town continued to rise through the early years of the new century. Against this background, arrangements of the kind Dimmock maintained, combining a settled domestic relationship with additional income drawn from other sources, were neither unique to her nor confined to any single district of London, but represented one among several strategies by which women of limited means supplemented household income during a period when few alternative forms of support existed for a woman living independently of her family of origin. The legal and administrative apparatus that had, in earlier decades, sought to regulate such arrangements through measures including the Contagious Diseases Acts had been repealed some 2 decades before the events of 1907, following a sustained campaign against their operation, and no equivalent statutory regime governed the conduct examined in the present case. The absence of such regulation meant that the arrangements Dimmock maintained fell outside any specific legal framework beyond the general criminal law, a circumstance that shaped the manner in which the investigation and subsequent press coverage approached the case, treating her occupation as a matter of social and moral comment, rather than as one giving rise to any distinct legal consideration in the prosecution of her killing. The railway that structured Bertram Shaw's working life, and consequently the pattern of his absences from the household at St Paul's Road, formed part of a network that had, by 1907, transformed the character of daily life for a very large portion of London's working population. The Midland Railway's dining car service, in which Shaw was employed, represented one of the more recently developed branches of railway catering, introduced to accommodate the growing expectation among travellers that meals should be available over the course of longer journeys between London and the industrial cities of the Midlands and the North. Employment of this kind carried with it a degree of steadiness and respectability greater than that available to many manual labourers, but it demanded in return the irregular and overnight absences that had placed Shaw away from London on the night his household was destroyed, a demand imposed by the operational requirements of the line rather than by any particular circumstance of his own household. The identity of the person who took Emily Dimmock's life on that September night was never established. Robert Wood stood trial and was acquitted, and no other suspect was ever brought before a court. The investigation was formally closed, the case remains open, the record remains incomplete. That is where the record of the second case ends. We turn now to the last of these 3 stories, further back in the century than the one just closed, and set not in a court of law, but in the compartment of an ordinary evening train. It concerns a different kind of failure altogether, not a jury reaching the wrong conclusion, but an investigation that never reached a conclusion at all, and a question that the passage of more than a century has not answered. The case of Elizabeth Annie Camp begins in South London in the winter of 1897. She was employed as housekeeper and barmaid at the Good Intent Public House in Woolworth, a densely populated district south of the River Thames. given over largely to small trades, licensed premises, and the close-packed terraced housing of the late Victorian working population. Walworth in this period sat within the wider expansion of London south of the Thames, a network of streets that had grown rapidly across the middle decades of the 19th century to house workers employed in the city's shops, markets, and service trades. The public house at which Elizabeth Camp worked was, like thousands of others across London, a fixture of daily neighbourhood life, a place of employment, of social gathering, and in her case, of residence. February of 1897 fell within the closing years of the reign of Queen Victoria, a monarch by then 60 years upon the throne, with the National Diamond Jubilee celebrations still some months distant. London itself was by this date the largest city in the world, its population exceeding 4 million, its streets served by an expanding network of railway lines that carried commuters, tradespeople, and travellers of every description into and out of the metropolis at all hours of the day and night. The railway occupied a central position in the life of the city and its surrounding districts by this date. The London and South Western Railway operated services connecting the outer suburbs and towns to the west of London, including Hounslow, with the great terminus at Waterloo, itself one of the busiest railway stations in the country. Trains of this period were constructed on the compartment system, in which each carriage was divided into a series of separate enclosed compartments. Each reached directly from the platform by its own door, and each entirely self-contained. Unlike railway carriages of later decades, these compartments possess no internal corridor connecting one to the next, and a passenger who boarded a compartment already occupied by another traveller would remain alone with that traveller, unseen and unheard by anyone else on the train, until the train next came to a stop. This structural feature of the period's railway carriages is directly relevant to the events that followed, and forms part of the documented record of the case. February evenings in this period brought early darkness, and stations along the line were lit by gas or, on some of the newer installations, by electric light, with platforms crowded by the mingled noise of arriving and departing trains, the hiss of steam, and the movement of passengers hurrying to make their connections. Waterloo Station itself, by 1897, was a sprawling and somewhat disordered terminus, expanded piecemeal over several decades to accommodate the growing volume of traffic upon the London and South Western Railway. Its platforms a familiar meeting point for travellers arriving from the western suburbs and beyond. Within this setting, Elizabeth Camp is documented as a woman in steady employment, engaged to be married, and in the ordinary course of arranging the practical details of that forthcoming marriage. The surviving record does not establish the date or place of her birth with certainty, nor does it provide details of her parents or her upbringing. What is established is her occupation at the time of her death, her residence at the Good Intent public house in Walworth, and her engagement to a man whom the surviving sources do not name with confidence. She is recorded as having at least one sister residing in the vicinity of Hounslow, to the west of London, and it was this sister whom she had travelled to visit on the day of her death. Visits of this kind between a woman in service or employment in central London and family members residing in the outer suburbs were an ordinary feature of working life in this period, made practicable by the very railway network that would shortly become the scene of her death. The surviving contemporary accounts describe her within the limits of what the record supports, as a woman of settled and respectable habits, established in her employment and looking forward to her marriage. On the 11th of February 1897, Elizabeth Camp spent the day at Hounslow in the company of her sister, in what the surviving record describes as an ordinary family visit. Nothing in the documented account suggests any dispute, threat, or unusual circumstance attending this visit, and the sources consulted for this case record no indication that she had reason to expect danger upon her return journey. In the course of the evening, she made her way to the railway station to begin the journey back toward London, travelling by the London and South Western Railway toward Waterloo, where her intended husband was to meet her upon her arrival in order to discuss arrangements for their forthcoming wedding. This detail of a man waiting upon the platform at Waterloo for a woman who had not arrived to meet him is well established across the sources examined for this case, and it is recorded here as part of the documented circumstances of the evening rather than as an interpretation of them. Elizabeth Camp boarded a second-class compartment for the journey toward Waterloo. The particular compartment in which she travelled was, in keeping with the standard construction of railway carriages upon this line in this period, entirely enclosed and without any corridor connection to the compartments on either side of it. A passenger boarding such a compartment at any of the stations along the route between Hounslow and Waterloo could enter and remain with her, unobserved by any other traveller on the train, for the full remainder of the journey. The surviving record does not establish with certainty at which station any such passenger may have entered the compartment in which Elizabeth Camp was travelling, nor does it establish how many stops the train made before reaching its destination. What the record does establish is that at some point during this journey, while the train proceeded along the line toward London, Elizabeth Camp was attacked within the enclosed compartment in which she was travelling alone. The attack upon Elizabeth Camp is documented in the surviving record as having resulted in severe injuries to the head, caused by repeated blows delivered with considerable force, and that these injuries proved rapidly fatal. The surviving accounts do not permit a fuller reconstruction of the sequence of the attack itself, and the sources consulted for this case do not establish the precise station or stretch of line at which it occurred, though the subsequent recovery of physical evidence discussed further below allows the general vicinity of the attack to be inferred with reasonable confidence. Following the attack, her body was found pushed beneath the seat of the compartment, in what the surviving record treats as a deliberate attempt to delay its discovery. No other passenger on the train is recorded as having witnessed any part of the attack, a circumstance directly attributable to the enclosed, corridorless construction of the compartment in which she travelled. The train on which Elizabeth Camp had been travelling arrived at Waterloo Station in the ordinary course of its scheduled service. Passengers travelling in the other compartments of the train departed the station without incident, and the train was, in time, moved to a siding or standing position for cleaning, in keeping with the ordinary procedure applied to arriving trains at a terminus of this size. It was in the course of this routine cleaning that a member of the railway staff, engaged in the ordinary work of preparing the carriage for its next service, observed a pair of legs protruding from beneath one of the seats within the compartment. Upon closer examination, the body of Elizabeth Camp was discovered, and the alarm was raised among the railway staff present at the station. The discovery of her body in this manner, by a cleaner engaged in routine work rather than through any earlier alarm raised during the journey itself, is a direct consequence of the isolation of the compartment in which she had travelled, and it is recorded as such in the surviving accounts of the case. The railway staff and railway police present at Waterloo were the first to be informed of the discovery, and the initial response to the crime was conducted, in the first instance, by those authorities with jurisdiction over the railway premises themselves. A period of time elapsed before the Metropolitan Police, whose jurisdiction extended to the investigation of murder within the metropolis, were formally notified of the crime. This delay in notification is documented in the subsequent official account of the case, and it is treated in that account, discussed further below, as a material factor in the eventual course and outcome of the investigation. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, the railway station at Waterloo became the scene of considerable activity, as staff, railway police, and subsequently the Metropolitan Police undertook the initial steps of securing the compartment, examining the body, and beginning the work of establishing what had occurred during the journey from Hounslow. The circumstances of Elizabeth Camp's final journey, considered together, establish a sequence that the surviving record treats with some consistency across the sources consulted for this case. An ordinary family visit to Hounslow, an evening return journey by rail toward a fiancé waiting at Waterloo, a second-class compartment without corridor access to the remainder of the train, an attack that no other passenger observed, and a discovery made only upon the train's arrival and subsequent cleaning at the terminus. Each of these elements is documented in the sources consulted, and each bears directly upon the investigation that followed, an investigation that was from its earliest hours constrained by the particular structural vulnerabilities of railway travel in this period, and by the procedural delay in notifying the police force with jurisdiction to pursue it. The investigation into the death of Elizabeth Camp was formally opened by the Metropolitan Police following their notification of the discovery at Waterloo Station. Officers were dispatched both to the station itself to examine the compartment in which the body had been found, and along the line of the railway between Hounslow and Waterloo, in an effort to establish the route by which the train had travelled and the points at which it had stopped. The compartment in which Elizabeth Camp had travelled was examined for physical evidence, and statements were taken from railway staff who had been on duty at the various stations along the route, as well as from other passengers who had travelled on the same train, in an effort to establish whether any of them had observed a fellow traveller entering or leaving the vicinity of the compartment in question. The investigation proceeded, in its earliest stages, along conventional lines for a crime of this nature, seeking to reconstruct the movements of the train, the movements of its passengers, and the possible movements of an attacker who had, by the nature of the crime, left the train at some point before its arrival at Waterloo. Officers walked sections of the line between Putney and Wandsworth in the days following the murder, examining the embankment on either side of the track for any object that might have been discarded from the moving train. This search yielded a chemist's pestle, recovered from the embankment in that stretch of the line, blood-stained and bearing hairs adhering to its surface. The discovery of the pestle in this location was treated by investigators as strong physical evidence, both of the instrument used in the attack and of the approximate point along the journey at which it had been thrown from the carriage window. A pestle of this kind, of the type used by chemists and druggists in the preparation of medicines, was not an item that would ordinarily be found in the possession of a railway passenger, and its recovery raised immediate questions as to how such an implement had come to be carried onto the train, and by whom. Investigators examined the pestle for any means of identifying its owner, and made inquiries among chemists and druggists in the districts served by the line, in an effort to trace its origin, though the surviving record does not establish that this line of inquiry produced a confirmed source. The identification of physical evidence in a case of this kind, in the year 1897, was subject to the limitations of forensic science as it then existed. Fingerprint identification, which would in later years become a standard tool of criminal investigation in England, was at this date only beginning to be studied by officials at Scotland Yard, and the systematic use of fingerprint evidence in the identification of suspects did not commence until several years later. No method existed in February of 1897 by which investigators could extract a usable identification from the pestle recovered on the embankment, notwithstanding the presence of blood and hair upon it, and the instrument therefore served as confirmation of the nature of the attack rather than as a direct means of identifying the person who had wielded it. Officers also established, in the course of their examination of Elizabeth Camp's effects, that her purse, described in the surviving accounts as green in colour, was missing, along with the ticket she had purchased for her journey. Neither the purse nor the ticket was recovered at any point during the investigation. The absence of these items raised the possibility that robbery had formed part of the motive for the attack, though the surviving record does not establish this as a settled conclusion, and the investigation did not treat it as the sole or confirmed explanation for what had occurred. Officers continued through the following days and weeks to take statements from railway staff at each of the stations along the route between Hounslow and Waterloo, seeking any recollection of a passenger boarding or leaving the train in circumstances that might connect him to the compartment in which Elizabeth Camp had travelled. Inquiries were made among ticket collectors, platform staff, and signalmen posted along the line, each of whom was in a position to observe, however briefly, the passengers passing through the stations under their charge on the evening in question. Officers also sought to establish, through interviews with Elizabeth Camp's fiancé, her employer at the Good Intent public house, and other persons acquainted with her, whether she was known to have any association with a person who might have wished her harm, or whether any circumstance in her recent life might account for the attack. The surviving record does not indicate that this line of inquiry produced evidence of a personal motive, and the investigation proceeded on the working assumption that Elizabeth Camp had been attacked by a stranger who had entered her compartment in the ordinary course of the journey, rather than by any person previously known to her. A post-mortem examination of Elizabeth Camp's body was conducted in accordance with the standard practice of the period in order to establish the cause of death and the nature of her injuries for the purposes of the subsequent inquest. The examination established that death had resulted from severe injuries to the head, inflicted by repeated blows delivered with considerable force, consistent with the use of a heavy implement such as the pestle recovered from the railway embankment. The examining physician recorded that the injuries were rapidly fatal, and that no other significant injury or contributing cause of death was identified. The surviving sources consulted for this case do not preserve the name of the physician who conducted the post-mortem examination, nor do they preserve the full text of his findings, and this account is accordingly confined to the conclusions that the surviving record establishes with confidence, namely the cause of death and its consistency with the weapon subsequently recovered. An inquest was convened in accordance with the ordinary procedure of English law for a sudden and violent death of this kind, before a coroner sitting with a jury drawn from the local population. The purpose of the inquest was to receive evidence as to the circumstances of Elizabeth Camp's death, and to return a formal verdict as to its cause. The surviving record consulted for this case does not preserve the name of the coroner who presided, nor the precise date on which the inquest was held, nor the exact wording of the verdict returned by the jury. What may be said with confidence is that the inquest proceeded on the basis of the evidence gathered by the police in the days following the discovery of the body, including the post-mortem findings, the recovery of the pestle, and the statements taken from railway staff and other witnesses, and that the case did not, at any point following the inquest, proceed to a criminal trial, since no suspect was ever formally charged with the murder. The absence of any prosecution in the case of Elizabeth Camp stands as one of its defining features, and it is documented in the official record of the investigation left by the Metropolitan Police themselves. Sir Edward Bradford, who held the office of Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police at the time of the murder, addressed the case directly in his annual report for the year 1897, a report published in November of the following year. In that report, Bradford recorded that a promising suspect had existed in the case, but that the opportunity to pursue him had been lost because the Metropolitan Police were not informed of the murder until several hours after the discovery of the body, a delay attributable to the initial handling of the case by railway staff and railway police, before the matter was passed to the force, with jurisdiction to investigate a murder of this kind. Bradford's report described this suspect in specific terms as a gentleman of good family who had, on more than one occasion, manifested tendencies toward violence, and who had on a previous occasion been placed by his own friends and relations in a private asylum on account of those tendencies. The report further recorded that this individual had left his home carrying a pestle on the day preceding the murder, and that he did not return home for some days afterward, arriving without the pestle in his possession. The account contained in Bradford's own official report represents the most direct and authoritative surviving statement regarding a possible suspect in the murder of Elizabeth Camp, and it is recorded here, as it appears in that report, as a documented historical claim made by the officer responsible for the Metropolitan Police at the time. The report does not supply the name of this individual, and no surviving source consulted for this case identifies him by name. He was never arrested, never formally questioned as a suspect in any proceeding that entered the public record, and never charged with any offence in connection with the death of Elizabeth Camp. The delay in notifying the Metropolitan Police, which Bradford's own report identifies as the reason this line of inquiry could not be pursued in time, meant that whatever opportunity existed to examine this individual's movements on the evening of the 11th of February had passed by the time investigators turned their attention to him. The surviving record does not establish what became of this individual afterward, whether he was ever formally investigated in later years, or whether his connection to the case was pursued by any other means. He remains, in the documented history of this case, an unnamed figure, described only through the language of the Commissioner's own report, never proven to have committed the murder, and never cleared of it either. The publication of Bradford's report in November of 1898 renewed public attention to a case that had already, at the time of the murder itself, commanded extensive coverage in the national press. Newspapers had reported at length upon the discovery of Elizabeth Camp's body at Waterloo Station, upon the recovery of the pestle along the embankment between Putney and Wandsworth, and upon the broader question of the safety of railway travel for women travelling alone in compartments of the kind in which she had died. The Spectator, in its coverage published on the 20th of February, 1897, addressed the murder directly in the context of this wider public concern, treating the case as an illustration of a structural danger inherent in the design of railway carriages then in general use across the country. The absence of any internal corridor connecting one compartment to the next meant that a passenger travelling alone had no means of summoning assistance and no means of being observed by any other traveller for the full duration of a journey between stops, a vulnerability that the murder of Elizabeth Camp brought into sharp and immediate public focus. The public concern documented in the contemporary press extended beyond the immediate question of the murder itself, into a broader debate about the design of railway rolling stock across the country. Correspondence and commentary published in the weeks following the murder raised the question of whether railway companies ought to be compelled, whether by regulation or by their own initiative, to fit carriages with some means by which a passenger in distress could alert the guard or the driver of the train, and whether the compartment system itself, so long a settled feature of British railway travel, remained suitable for a network that now carried women travelling alone in significant numbers, at all hours, across considerable distances. These questions did not produce an immediate change in the construction of railway carriages, and the compartment system, together with its want of any internal corridor, remained the standard arrangement on many lines for a number of years following the death of Elizabeth Camp. The murder was nonetheless cited repeatedly in later years, in discussions of railway safety, as an early and prominent illustration of the dangers inherent in that arrangement, and it contributed to an argument more fully realised in the decades that followed, for the introduction of corridor connections between compartments and for the fitting of communication cords by which a passenger could signal for assistance while a train was in motion. The case did not proceed further than the inquest, and the official record left by the Metropolitan Police, through the annual report of Commissioner Bradford, stands as the closest approach to a formal conclusion that the investigation ever reached. No further arrest followed the publication of that report, and no later development in the surviving sources indicates that the case was reopened or that new evidence emerged in the years after 1898. The file remained in the records of the Metropolitan Police and of the Railway Company upon whose line the murder had occurred, a case in which the physical evidence, the pestle recovered from the embankment, the missing person ticket, and the severe injuries established by the post-mortem examination had never been connected with certainty to any named individual. The description preserved in Bradford's report of a gentleman of good family with a documented history of violent tendencies and a previous confinement in a private asylum remained the nearest the investigation came to naming a responsible party, and it remained, in the same report, an account of an opportunity lost through the delay in notifying the force with jurisdiction to pursue it. Elizabeth Camp's murder holds a distinct place in the history of the railway network on which she died, remembered specifically as the first murder of a woman aboard a train in Britain. This distinction has preserved the case within the institutional memory of the organisations most closely connected to the railway itself and the successor to the railway police force that first responded to the discovery at Waterloo. The British Transport Police maintains an official account of the case among its recorded history of significant investigations. Within that institutional record, the murder of Elizabeth Camp is treated as a formative episode in the early history of railway policing, illustrating both the particular vulnerabilities created by the compartment system and the practical and jurisdictional difficulties that could arise when a crime occurred on railway property, straddling the responsibilities of railway staff, railway police, and the Metropolitan Police proper. The case is referenced in later writing on the history of British railways and on the history of policing more broadly, generally in connection with the reforms in railway carriage design and railway safety practice that followed over time from the public concern the murder had generated. The case has also received attention in modern retrospective accounts of unsolved Victorian crime, appearing from time to time in discussions alongside other unresolved cases of the same decade. Some such accounts have drawn loose and general comparisons between the murder of Elizabeth Camp and the series of unsolved murders that had occurred in Whitechapel some years earlier, on the basis that both belong to the broader category of Victorian murders that were never solved. No evidence in the sources consulted for this case establishes any connection between the two, and the surviving record supports no basis for treating the murder of Elizabeth Camp as related in perpetrator or in circumstance to those earlier crimes. The comparison, where it appears in later writing, is offered as a general observation about the frequency of unsolved violent crime in this period of British history, rather than as a claim resting upon any shared evidence. The murder of Elizabeth Camp unfolded within a railway network that by the closing years of the 19th century had become deeply woven into the ordinary rhythms of daily life across England, carrying working women, such as herself, between employment, family, and the practical business of arranging a life still ahead of them. The London and South Western Railway, on whose line she travelled on the evening of the 11th of February, operated dozens of services daily along the route connecting Hounslow and the western suburbs to the terminus at Waterloo, each train made up of a series of carriages divided in the manner already described into self-contained compartments reached directly from the platform. A woman travelling this route in the evening, after a day spent visiting family, would have been one among a great many such travellers making similar journeys on the same evening, along the same line, in carriages built to the same design, a design that offered privacy and quiet to the ordinary passenger, and offered, in the particular circumstances of this journey, no protection at all to a woman travelling alone in the company of a stranger who meant her harm. The public house at which Elizabeth Camp worked stood within a district shaped by the particular rhythms of London south of the river, where licensed premises of the kind she served in were woven closely into the working life of the streets around them. A housekeeper and barmaid in an establishment such as the Good Intent occupied a position that combined domestic labour with public-facing work, responsible for the daily maintenance of the premises, the serving of customers, and very often residence upon the same site where she was employed. Such positions were held predominantly by women in this period, and they carried with them a degree of independence uncommon among other forms of female employment, since a woman in such a post typically managed her own working hours within the bounds set by the licensing requirements of the house, and typically lived apart from her family of origin, supporting herself through her own wages. The public house itself functioned as one of the principal gathering points of its neighbourhood, a place where tradesmen, labourers, and residents of the surrounding streets convened in the evenings, and the staff who kept such premises running were, by the nature of the work, known figures within their immediate community, recognised by name and by face among the regular custom of the house. The journey that Elizabeth Camp undertook on the 11th of February from Hounslow to Waterloo was not a long one by the standards of the network she travelled upon, yet it carried her across a considerable span of the metropolis and its western approaches, passing through a series of stations that marked the gradual transition from the semi-rural character of the outer districts to the dense, built-up geography of inner London. Hounslow, in this period, remained on the edge of London's continuous urban growth, a town with its own distinct identity, its streets bordered in places by open ground and market gardens that had not yet been absorbed into the unbroken expanse of housing further east. The railway line carried passengers from stations of this character through a lengthening succession of suburbs, each more densely built than the last, before crossing the river and drawing into the great covered platforms of Waterloo. A woman making this journey in the evening, in the middle of February, would have watched the country beyond the carriage window darkened by stages, the scattered lights of outlying stations giving way, mile by mile, to the denser illumination of the inner suburbs, and finally to the crowded, gaslit expanse of the terminus itself. The second-class compartment in which Elizabeth Camp travelled represented a particular tier within the railway system of fares and accommodation, positioned between the more austere third-class carriages used by the great majority of ordinary working travellers, and the more costly first-class compartments reserved for those able to pay a higher fare for greater comfort and, in principle, greater privacy. A second-class ticket of this kind was well within the means of a woman in steady employment such as Elizabeth Camp, and it afforded a degree of respectability and comfort appropriate to a woman travelling to meet her intended husband to discuss the practical business of their wedding. The compartment itself would have been upholstered, lit by an oil or gas lamp fitted into the roof of the carriage, and furnished with two facing rows of seats, each capable of holding several passengers, though on this particular evening, whether by chance or otherwise, she came to occupy it with only one other traveller, a circumstance the surviving record does not explain and cannot reconstruct with certainty. The search conducted by police officers along the embankment between Putney and Wandsworth in the days following the discovery of Elizabeth Camp's body required the systematic examination of a considerable length of trackside ground, walked and re-walked by officers working in the belief that an object thrown from a moving train would come to rest somewhere within a predictable distance of the line itself. The terrain along this stretch of the London and South Western Railway ran through a mixture of open embankment, garden walls, and the backs of houses that had, by this period, grown up close against the railway's boundary on either side, the product of decades of building that had followed the railway's own expansion through this part of southwest London. Officers engaged in this search would have worked methodically along the length of the cutting and embankment, examining the undergrowth, the ballast at the trackside, and the ground beyond the boundary fencing, in weather that, in mid-February, offered short daylight hours and the persistent cold and damp typical of an English winter. The recovery of the pestle in this stretch of ground, rather than at any other point along the considerably longer route between Hounslow and Waterloo, allowed investigators to conclude with reasonable confidence that the object had been discarded from the train somewhere in the vicinity of Putney or Wandsworth. And this conclusion in turn shaped the department's understanding of where, along the full length of the journey, the attack itself was most likely to have taken place. A pestle of the kind recovered from the embankment was, in the ordinary course of trade, an implement associated with the work of a chemist or druggist, used in combination with a mortar to grind and combine the ingredients of medicines prepared upon the premises of a shop. Such an implement was not a tool that an ordinary traveller would be expected to carry upon a railway journey, and its presence in the compartment in which Elizabeth Camp was attacked raised, from the earliest stage of the investigation, the question of what occupation or connection might explain its being brought aboard the train at all. Investigators making inquiries among chemists and druggists operating shops in the districts served by the line sought to establish whether any such implement had been reported missing, or whether any tradesman recalled selling or otherwise parting with a pestle in the period immediately preceding the murder. Inquiries of this kind, directed at a specific and identifiable trade, were a standard method by which police in this period sought to trace an unusual object recovered in connection with a crime, working outward from the object itself toward the community of persons who might reasonably be expected to possess or have access to one. The inquest convened into the death of Elizabeth Camp proceeded according to the established form of an English coroner's inquest of this period, a proceeding conducted not as a criminal trial, but as a formal inquiry into the fact and cause of a death, presided over by a coroner and assisted by a jury drawn from among the local residents of the district in which the body had been found or in which the death had occurred. Members of a coroner's jury in this period were customarily required, as part of their duty, to view the body of the deceased before hearing the evidence presented to them, a practice intended to impress upon the jury the gravity of the matter before them and to allow them to form their own impression of the injuries described in the medical evidence that followed. Witnesses called before the inquest would have included the railway staff who discovered the body, the officers who conducted the initial investigation, and the physician who performed the post-mortem examination, each giving evidence under oath as to the facts within their own knowledge. The jury, having heard this evidence, was charged with returning a verdict as to the cause of death, a verdict that in a case of this kind, where no person had been identified as responsible, would ordinarily record that death had resulted from willful murder by a person or persons unknown, a formula employed in English coronial practice, specifically for cases in which a violent death was established beyond doubt, but no individual could be named as its author. The newspaper coverage that followed the discovery of Elizabeth Camp's body extended across the London press and into provincial newspapers throughout the country, in keeping with the considerable public appetite general throughout this period for detailed reporting of violent crime, and particularly of crime touching upon the safety of railway travel, a mode of transport that by 1897 had become a part of daily life for readers in every part of the country. Illustrated papers of the period frequently accompanied their reporting of prominent crimes with engraved depictions of the scene of discovery, the railway compartment, or the individuals connected with the case, and reporting of this kind served to fix the details of a case such as this one firmly in the public imagination, well beyond the district in which the crime itself had occurred. The account carried in the Spectator on the 20th of February 1897, situating the murder within the wider question of railway carriage design, was one among a considerable volume of contemporary commentary addressing the case from this same angle, reflecting a public conversation that extended well beyond the particular facts of Elizabeth Camp's death into a broader and more general anxiety concerning the safety of solitary travel by rail. The report subsequently published by Commissioner Bradford, describing the case among the business of the Metropolitan Police for the year, followed the established form of the Commissioner's annual reports of this period. documents prepared for submission to the Home Office, and in due course made available to Parliament and to the public, summarising the principal work of the force across the preceding 12 months, including its notable successes and its notable failures. The inclusion of the case of Elizabeth Camp within such a report, and the frankness with which Bradford acknowledged that a promising line of inquiry had been lost through a delay in notification, represented an unusually candid admission for an official document of this kind, prepared by the head of the force itself rather than drawn from press speculation or private complaint. The report's account of the unnamed suspect, his family background, his prior confinement, and his movements in the days surrounding the murder, stands as the most detailed surviving description of any individual connected to the case, and it was this report, rather than any contemporary arrest or public naming, that fixed the shape of the case as it would be understood in the years that followed. At Waterloo that evening, among the crowd gathered beneath the great arched roof of the terminus, was the man to whom Elizabeth Camp was engaged to be married, standing at the appointed place to meet her train and to spend the remainder of the evening in the ordinary business of discussing the wedding that the two of them were then preparing. He would have watched the train draw in along its platform, watched the doors of the second and third class carriages open, and the passengers step down onto the platform in their accustomed numbers, and watched as the minutes passed and the crowd around him thinned, for a face that did not appear among them. The surviving record does not preserve his words or his actions in the hours that followed, nor the manner in which he first learned that the woman he had come to meet would not be walking toward him that evening. Only the bare fact established in the documented account of the case that he had been waiting for her arrival at the time her body was discovered elsewhere upon the same train. It is this single spare detail of an ordinary appointment kept by one party and never fulfilled by the other, that the surviving sources return to as the clearest surviving indication of what the murder of Elizabeth Camp meant to those who had known her, a life interrupted at the exact point where its next ordinary chapter, marriage and the settled household that would have followed it, was to have begun. Word of the murder would have reached the Good Intent public house in Woolworth within hours of the discovery at Waterloo, carried by the same channels of newspaper reporting and word of mouth that carried it to households across London and beyond. A woman employed and resident at premises such as these was known, in the ordinary way of such establishments, to the regular customers who frequented the house, to the tradesmen who supplied it, and to the neighbours whose own daily lives intersected with hers across the counter of the bar or in the course of her work about the premises. The sudden and violent end of a woman so situated within her own small community would have been felt, in the days following the murder, as a disruption not only to the household of the public house itself, obliged to continue its business and very likely to find some other person to take up the duties she had performed, but to the wider network of acquaintance that had grown up around her presence there. The surviving record does not preserve individual statements from those who knew her in this capacity, beyond the general characterization, carried in contemporary press accounts, of a woman of settled and respectable habits established in her employment. And it is this characterization, sparse as it is, that stands as the surviving record's closest approach to an account of who Elizabeth Camp was to those around her. The London and South Western Railway, as the company upon whose line the murder had occurred, faced in the aftermath of the case a form of scrutiny distinct from that directed at the police investigation itself, concerning the adequacy of the precautions it had in place, or had failed to have in place, for the safety of passengers travelling in its compartments. Railway companies of this period were commercial enterprises operating under a general framework of regulation that governed matters of public safety in respects such as signalling, the condition of track and rolling stock, and the conduct of company servants. But the interior design of passenger compartments, and in particular the presence or absence of a corridor or other means of communication between one compartment and the next, remained very largely a matter for each company's own commercial judgment, weighed against the cost of constructing and maintaining carriages of a more elaborate design. A murder committed within one of its own compartments and reported at length in the national press placed the London and South Western Railway, and by extension every other company operating compartment carriages upon its network, under a form of public pressure to which no formal regulatory requirement yet corresponded, a pressure exerted through newspaper columns, through public correspondence, and through the accumulating weight of a case that would be cited in later years, whenever the safety of railway passengers came under renewed public discussion. The years that followed the murder of Elizabeth Camp saw the gradual, uneven introduction, across the various companies operating railways in Britain, of design changes intended to address precisely the vulnerability that her case had exposed, among them the fitting of internal corridors connecting compartments along the length of a carriage, and the installation of communication cords by which a passenger in distress could signal directly to the guard of the train while it remained in motion. These changes did not follow immediately from the murder itself, and the compartment system, without corridor access, remained in service on many lines for a considerable period afterward. But the case of Elizabeth Camp was cited repeatedly in the discussion that accompanied these gradual reforms, as an instance in which the design then in general use had left a passenger entirely without recourse or assistance for the whole of a journey during which her life was taken. The connection drawn between her case and these later changes in railway carriage design rests upon the documented public discussion that followed her death, discussion recorded in the contemporary press and referenced in later accounts of the history of railway safety, rather than upon any single traceable act of legislation or company decision that can be attributed to her case alone. Within the institutional record maintained by the successor organisations responsible for policing the railway network, the case of Elizabeth Camp has continued to occupy a distinct position, catalogued and preserved as part of the documented history of railway crime in Britain. Consulted by those researching the early years of railway policing and the particular jurisdictional questions that a crime committed aboard a moving train, crossing the boundary between railway property and the wider city, could raise for the authorities responsible for investigating it. The case illustrates within that institutional memory the practical difficulty that arose whenever the initial response to a crime fell to railway staff and railway police before passing to the Metropolitan Police proper, a difficulty that in this instance was identified by the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police himself as the direct cause of an investigation's failure to reach its evident and promising line of inquiry in time. The lesson drawn from the case within this institutional record concerns not only the vulnerability of a solitary railway passenger, but the vulnerability of an investigation itself, when responsibility for the earliest and most urgent hours of inquiry is divided between more than one authority, and when the passage of those hours is measured not in minutes, but in the time required for word to travel from one jurisdiction to another. The particular difficulty identified within that institutional record extended beyond the single delay in notification that Bradford's report described, touching upon the wider question of how authority over a moving train was to be understood at all, at a moment when the vehicle itself might pass through the territory of several different police forces and several different local authorities in the course of a single journey. A crime committed between Hounslow and Waterloo did not occur within any single fixed location in the way that a crime committed within a house or upon a public street occurred, and the investigators who took up the case were required, from their earliest hours of work, to treat the whole length of the line as a single scene, extending across many miles and several distinct jurisdictions, rather than as a single point that could be secured, examined, and left undisturbed until its evidence had been fully recovered. The embankment search that recovered the pestle exemplified this difficulty in its own way, requiring officers to extend their inquiry along a considerable stretch of trackside ground, precisely because the scene of the crime itself could not be fixed to any single identifiable spot, only inferred after the fact from the point at which its evidence came to rest. This same difficulty bore upon the railway company's own record of the journey, upon which investigators depended in reconstructing the movements of the train and the points at which passengers had boarded and alighted along its route. Railway staff at each station were required, in the ordinary course of their duties, to record the departure and arrival of services, to collect and inspect tickets, and to observe, in a general way, the passengers passing through their charge. Yet none of these ordinary duties had been designed with the reconstruction of a crime in mind, and the information they yielded to investigators in the days following the murder was accordingly partial, dependent upon the memory of individual staff members for events that had, at the time they occurred, appeared entirely unremarkable. A ticket collector or platform porter, observing the ordinary press of passengers boarding a train on a February evening, had no reason, in the moment, to fix any particular traveller in his memory, and it was only after the murder became known that such men were asked to strain their recollection backward across days already past in search of a face or a detail that might, at the time it was observed, have seemed of no consequence whatsoever. It was against this same difficulty of a crime scene extended across miles of moving track, and a record of passengers kept only in the scattered memory of railway staff, that the delay in notifying the Metropolitan Police weighed most heavily, since the individual described in Bradford's report as a promising suspect required precisely the kind of prompt, coordinated inquiry conducted while memories remained fresh and while his own movements in the days immediately following the murder might still have been traced, that the delay in passing the case from railway authority to metropolitan authority had made impossible to mount in time. Every hour that passed between the discovery of the body at Waterloo and the formal opening of the Metropolitan Police investigation was, in this sense, an hour in which the ordinary evidence of a criminal inquiry, the recollection of witnesses, the traceable movements of a suspect, the freshness of physical evidence still to be recovered, continued to fade, and it was this slow erosion of an investigation's earliest and most perishable material, rather than any single dramatic failure, that the surviving record identifies as the reason the case of Elizabeth Camp was never brought to a conclusion in any court of law. The case of Elizabeth Camp was the last of these three cases to enter the historical record. No arrest was ever made. The investigation was formally closed. The case remains open. The record remains incomplete.